Some kind words for Coach Harbaugh from an unlikely source. Next on the Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the front. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And the leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Ron Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his granddaddy, the quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Greetings and welcome to another week of the Michigan Podcast. I am Steve Deace, and listen, let me just start off by saying we are beyond pleased with the reaction we received to last week's debut episode. We have been consistently in the top 150 or so of all sports podcasts on iTunes. We've been in the top 5 in the college and high school category. We've been very pleased with how many views the television side of things has received on YouTube as well. So please just keep sharing that information about the Michigan Podcast. We really appreciate how much you guys are doing to help us to get the word out. And you can subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. You can be a subscriber right here on YouTube. If you're watching the video, please click like on this video and subscribe and share it as well. Coming up a little bit later on in this week's episode, Mitch Light, the editor of Athlon's College Football, is going to join us. They have a fantastic preview out looking at the last 50 years of college football since it's their 50th anniversary. We'll talk about that as well as where they think the Wolverines are going to be this fall. But first, we start with this week's big story. Well, Paul Finebaum is not necessarily persona most grata among the Maize and Blue faithful, and he has done a lot deservedly to earn that persona non grata status. He has gone from favorably comparing Jim Harbaugh to the Donald Trump of college football to unfavorably comparing our coach to the Donald Trump of college football. But recently he appeared on SiriusXM's College Sports Channel and said this.
As much as I have been critical of Harbaugh for off-the-field issues, I think the decision to take his school to Rome and the execution of that trip was one of the most amazing events that I have witnessed in college football. I think it's the move of the year. I think it's the move of the year in 2017 in college football. I think Jim Harbaugh has trumped Nick Saban and Urban Meyer and nearly everyone else with that move. There was just something about it. Watching him hand the helmet to Pope Francis that to me was mesmerizing. It was awe-inspiring, and I'm interested to see what other coaches will do in response to that. I'm interested in seeing what Harbaugh does for an encore. However, that doesn't absolve him from the football field. And while they had a great season that ended badly, he has to improve that product. I know it's easy to harp on consecutive third-place finishes in their own division, but if he doesn't beat Ohio State one of these years, his credibility will begin to shrink. And I think that is the issue facing him. I believe he's an elite coach, Barrett, but he happens to reside in a very difficult neighborhood. And I think beating Urban Meyer in the Big Ten is equal to difficulty in terms of beating Nick Saban in the SEC. I don't see anyone doing it right now.
So even though Paul Finebaum, or Pete, as his friend Coach Harbaugh likes to refer to him, has said plenty of things that have enraged Michigan fans, and rightfully so, over the last year or so especially, I think everything he said there is 100% correct, both the good and the constructive criticism. I agree. That move of taking the football team to Rome, the reason I think it was so powerful is because all the other things that Jim has done, the IMG Academy, we're going to do satellite camps. Those are all looked at as things where people are like, well, he doesn't really do the satellite camps to help kids get exposure to college recruiters. He's doing this for himself. He's doing this to help him recruit. He's not taking the kids to IMG Academy in Florida for spring break because some of them may not be able to afford one on their own. He's doing this because there's a couple good kids at IMG Academy he wants to recruit. He's got an angle. And yeah, I get that. One of the things I often like to say in my day job is, people have two reasons why they do things. There's the right reason, and then there's the real reason. And self-interest to some extent has to drive what you do if you're in a profession as absolutely competitive, uber competitive and cutthroat as college football coaching is. But I think the reason the Rome trip became such a transcendent event is because even though it was done in the same spirit as those other things that Harbaugh was doing, this was one, though, they could not claim was being done for any other non-altruistic motivation. And I think that now it retroactively, therefore, adds credibility to what Jim was trying to do with the IMG Academy, to what Jim was trying to do with the satellite camps. In fact, one of the things that Coach Harbaugh said over in Rome is that from a team-building exercise, this is going to be far more rewarding for this year's football team than he ever imagined. Well, that's a statement of self-interest right there. He's saying, hey, this is going to do a good job of bringing a lot of young guys who have not played together. We're a really young team, talented, but a lot of guys that have not had major leadership positions, have maybe not built chemistry as a team. And this is going to go a long way towards establishing those things for this fall. That's a statement of self-interest. But because of the other altruistic aspects of this trip that were so highlighted from a cultural standpoint, from an educational standpoint, from an interpersonal standpoint, a lot of the same media that has been very skeptical and critical of Coach Harbaugh for doing these things under the guise of it's what's best for the kids when really it's what's best for him, they really kind of overlooked that. And I think it does add a layer of credibility retroactively to all the other things that Jim has done, certainly because he wants the Michigan brand to be a powerful brand once more. Certainly because he wants to win as many games as he possibly can. But it's also because Jim himself was a student athlete. Coach Harbaugh himself, Jimmy himself, was a college football player. He himself has personally benefited beyond anything he probably could have done in any other walk of life because of what football has given to him, and he wants to see it open up those opportunities for more young men just like him. And I think you heard Paul Finebaum tap into that with his comments about how transcendent this moment was. And I even agree with his constructive criticism. I mean, listen, if Michigan loses to Ohio State a third year in a row, I am fairly confident there will be plenty of people disappointed on the message boards, plenty of people that will be calling, Sam Webb and Michael Spath and those guys at WTKA Ann Arbor, or the various shows on 97.1 The Ticket in Detroit, calling and complaining and saying, hey, when are we ever going to get, cross that threshold? We appreciate everything Coach Harbaugh has done, but now it's time to beat Urban Meyer. Now it's time to beat Ohio State. So if you're offended by that, let's be honest. Plenty of people are going to be making those calls in November if indeed Michigan loses to Ohio State again. So I think even that criticism is fair. And you even heard Paul Finebaum refer to Coach Harbaugh as, quote, an elite coach. And he's right. In fact, if you look at coaches who have coached a minimum of 4 years in the NFL, he has one of the top 10 all-time winning percentages in the entire history of the National Football League. The hot mess that was Stanford. They pulled off one of the biggest point spread upsets of all time. He was a 40-point underdog to USC. His first year at Stanford, they won that game. Michigan had averaged barely 7 wins a season for the decade prior to his arrival. And now you look at 10 wins his first 2 years. And there's a chance, depending on how Michigan starts this fall, that Harbaugh could post the best first 30-game record by a Michigan coach in the last quarter century at least. So there's no question he's an elite coach. But there's also no question that if he wants the rest of the nation to see that as well, he's got to beat Urban Meyer. You know, as one of Jim's favorite sports entertainers, Ric Flair, would say, if you want to be the man, you got to beat the man.
It's on a 25-second.
Brown's the quarterback, and in the category of understatement, this is the ball game. 4th and 3. Lots of time. To the end zone for Colasar.
Touchdown.
Touchdown!
You know, when you're jonesing for football season to start, there are certain benchmarks, right? You know, like for me, I'm a big NFL draft guy because it's the merger of college and pro football, but it also essentially marks halftime of the offseason. And then the next big benchmark around Memorial Day, 1st of June, when the college football preview magazines hit the shelves, and of course, annually, one of the best looking ones and one of the first ones out is Athlon's college football. In fact, they're celebrating their 50th anniversary of that annual here this year. I've got my copy here with me, in fact. And we have with us on the Michigan podcast, the editor of Athlon Sports College Football. Mitch Light is with us. And Mitch, it is a pleasure to have you on the show, brother. How are you?
How you doing?
I'm doing well. Now, I wore for this week's show, I've got the official M-Den Legends Desmond Howard throwback jersey, because one of the really neat features, Mitch, you guys have in your magazine this year is you look back over the last 50 years, you guys picked the 50 best college football players. There are 2 Wolverines on that list. One of them, of course, is Charles Woodson, and the other, Desmond Howard. Tell us about those 2 decisions.
Yeah, well, we wanted to do our best to celebrate 50 years. You know, just 50 years is a good number to look back. It's pretty much, I mean, I don't know, you could argue the modern era of college football. I know a lot of Michigan fans would like to look back into the 20s and 30s, or even previously to that when Michigan was so dominant. But it's a difficult task to pick the 50 greatest. So we sort of, to pass the buck and more sort of to get a better list, we enlisted a panel. We have 16 panelists that we used. I tried to get a nice geographic, get some geographic diversity, get some generational diversity, some old timers, some guys who've covered the sport more recently, guys like Bruce Feldman, Stuart Mandel, guys like from the East Coast like Tom Lucci, who's covered college football for years for the New York Star Ledger, some Midwest guys. So it's our list, it's Athlon Sports list, but it's really a list of 16 panelists. So Charles Woodson, when we went into this, was pretty sure he was going to be on the list, pretty high. And what you have in front of you there, Steve, I'm flipping through. I think he's 10?
He's
10?
11.
Number 11.
Yep.
Wasn't surprised there. Desmond Howard, snuck in, I believe, at number 50. And I think we've been accused. I've seen some feedback about people accusing us of just throwing some, Heisman Trophy winners on the end. Well, like I said, it didn't work that way. It's really a list of an accumulation of all the other votes. So it's not like we said, oh, we need Danny Werfel in there. We need, Desmond Howard on there. So Desmond came in at 50. I think he was on 9 of 16 ballots. I could go back and look that up. But, Michigan's had a lot of great football players. But, I would say those 2 in the last 50 years, at least from our panelists, stood out. Anybody you surprised from Michigan that didn't make that list, Steve?
Not really. And we'll get to some guys that maybe also could have qualified in a moment, because there's several players that I'm sure Michigan fans are like, what about Tom Brady and others? Guys that maybe made more of a mark in the NFL than they did in college football. But when you look at Desmond Howard, you got to go back to the era in which he played, Mitch. I mean, we had the run and shoot offenses coming in with Houston, right, under Jack Pardee and I think it was June Jones or whoever the other coach was, the Andre Ware, David Klingler teams. They were throwing the ball a lot.
Jenkins, wasn't it Jenkins? Jenkins.
That's right. Jenkins was the June Jones was the other run and shoot guy that used to be at Hawaii and SMU. But in that era, you didn't have routinely receivers. You still don't even now, even with air raid offenses. It wasn't often that receivers had 17 touchdown receptions. And Desmond Howard did that in 1991, even though Derek Alexander, who was also considered a high-caliber player, got hurt early in the year. He was double, triple teamed every single week. They essentially had to create what is a player we see a lot now, that slot player with end-arounds and punt returns and kick returns. That position is a staple in college football now. But Gary Moeller back in the day essentially had to create that for Desmond Howard so that defenses wouldn't key on him without Derek Alexander in the lineup. And that was as dominant of a year that any wide receiver has had statistically up until that point in college football history, even more dominant than the season Tim Brown had a few years prior to that when he was the other receiver in that era to win the Heisman Trophy, Mitch.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of good points. I think historically people don't realize how difficult it's been for wide receivers to win the Heisman. And, good or bad, you need certain Heisman moments like Charles Woodson had and Desmond Howard had, the great fourth down catch playing for a good Michigan team. So yeah, definitely. And that's the one thing that was difficult about this list, looking at stats and putting them in context, quarterbacks' numbers today are so much better than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think actually on our list, we probably have the opposite of a recency bias. I think there's a lot of really good players recently who did not get enough credit because people, maybe wanted to look further back or were just saying, oh, stats are skewed now because guys are putting up so many, throwing for so many more yards. Running backs are running for more yards. Receivers are accumulating more yards. Hey, real quick, the only other guy, I've been looking at my list right now, Steve, the only other Michigan player I believe that would have been in our top 100 if we extrapolate further was Anthony Carter. He from a vote standpoint, he would have come in at 74th.
And I was going to get to him because I know there are going to be a lot of Michigan fans that are going to be like, how is Anthony Carter not on the list? A 3-time consensus All-American, and he did it while playing wide receiver for Bo Schembechler, Mitch. That says something. Made Bo essentially change his entire approach to offensive football when he got him on campus. So I'm fine with Desmond Howard where he's at on the list. I'm just happy he's on the list. I was really surprised Anthony Carter was not on the list. Your thoughts on that, Mitch?
Yeah, again, I think, he's a guy. What years did he play? Mid-'80s?
79 to 82.
Okay, so I'm 45, so I remember him in college a little bit before my time. He's just one of those difficult guys, and I guess I'm sort of defending our panelists here to put in context because he was kind of ahead of his time at that position. He was on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of 16 ballots and only got one vote higher than 40th. So yeah, a little surprised, among the wide receivers who did not make it. Actually, I'm looking right now. He appears to be Tim Brown was at 61. And then after that, Anthony Carter was basically the second wide receiver not to make it.
Well, we have this conversation every year with March Madness, too. We sit around, Dick Vitale tells us every year, this team should have been in, this team should have been in. There's only so many spots. You have to tell me who should have been taken out. And as I look through the list, and I'm a Michigan fan, I remember Keith Jackson's era at Oklahoma very well. He was on the 2 great wishbone teams, and Jamel Holloway was the quarterback, and he essentially was the only time they completed a pass was to him. I don't know that I would have put him on that list ahead of Tim Brown or Anthony Carter for that matter, but he might be the one person I would have taken out of the list instead. I mean, when you've got Doug Flutie, who I could make an argument was the greatest college quarterback of the last 50 years, when you have him 36th on the list, that tells you the kind of talent we're dealing with. The one bone of contention I do have, though, is I'm trying to figure out, and this is the first homer thing I noticed on the list, Mitch, how Charles Woodson is not in the top 10 as the only primarily defensive player to win the Heisman. But Hugh Green, who didn't win the Heisman as primarily a defensive player, is in the top 10. You got to explain that to me. I mean, Hugh Green was on a team that was number 1 most of that year, didn't win the national title. Woodson led his team to the national championship. Hugh Green did not. Woodson won the Heisman. Hugh Green did not. How is Hugh Green in the top 10 of the last 50 years, but Woodson isn't?
Got to ask the voters, Steve. I'm passing the buck on this one. I'm looking at our tallies right now. someone, I'm not going to out anybody, but one of our 16 voters did not have Charles Woodson in his top 50, which obviously hurt. But there's also one voter that did not have Hugh Green either.
How is that even possible? Was Phil Fulmer on your panel, Mitch? Phil Fulmer?
This person I respect very greatly, but I'm not going to out him.
Now, the reason I ask if Phil Fulmer was on your panel is because there's a Michigan urban legend that the reason Nebraska won the coaches poll in '97 is that Phil Fulmer voted Michigan 4th in order to drop Michigan down enough points for Nebraska to win that split national championship. That's an old Michigan urban legend. I don't know if it's true or not. So I was wondering, was he the voter, the old Tennessee coach, was he the voter that didn't think Charles Woodson, the only primarily defensive player to ever win the Heisman, was one of the 50 greatest players of the last 50 years?
Phil Fulmer was not on our panel, but we are here in Nashville, Tennessee, so I'm well aware of the Charles Woodson, Peyton Manning, Tennessee, Michigan drama of those years.
Well, it is a really good list. I mean, I would argue the three greatest college quarterbacks I saw in my lifetime, and when you look at their total body of work, would have been Doug Flutie, Tim Tebow, Vince Young, and I mean, those guys none of them were even ranked among the top 5 players of all time. Herschel Walker, number 1. Defend that decision. I mean, I think you can easily defend it, but what do you think the best reason for it is, Mitch?
Just dominance, physical dominance. I think, he's before my time, but if I was, the Athlon vote, he was number 1, and Athlon had 1 vote. We treated ourselves as a staff as one panelist. The most physically dominant running back maybe ever, definitely if you look back in his era when guys just weren't that big, weren't that strong. I'm looking right now, of our 16 panelists, he was first or second on all but 1. So he was, basically he wasn't close to not being number 1, put it that way.
There's some other great historical stuff in here, folks. I would highly recommend Athlon's list their 50 biggest news events impacting college football of the last 50 years. Don't want to give all those away, so you'll actually go out and buy the magazine, so check that out on your own time, especially because we do want to spend the rest of the time we have with Mitch talking about how they see this season unfolding, beginning with Michigan. You guys have them ranked number 10 in your preseason poll. Despite all of that turnover, are you guys essentially saying that Jim Harbaugh is now one of those, benefit of the doubt coaches? He's Dabo Swinney. He's Nick Saban. He's Urban Meyer. Because we have seen a few programs right now. There's always been that one school, Florida State for a while, Nebraska, Notre Dame under Lou Holtz, Miami all those years under Jimmy Johnson and Dennis Erickson, that they were recruiting at such a level it really didn't matter how many guys they lost to the NFL. Well, we got like 4 or 5 schools that are like that in college football right now. Are you guys saying that you think Michigan under Jim Harbaugh they've reached that level already?
Yes, because if you looked at Michigan, what they did last year and what they lost, and you just kind of treated them as another program, you'd be like, I can't see it this year, man. They lost too much all over the place. They lost all their pass catchers, lost so much in the back 7, maybe a top 20 team. But when has Jim Harbaugh not had a good team, other than maybe his first year at Stanford? He had been, you said benefit of the doubt. That is a term that, we use. And we like to judge each team, each program on its own merits every year. But you also have to factor in the coaching effect, the program, the culture of that program. And just feel that the way they've recruited, and now they do have some, good players back. I think obviously the defensive line should be very good, and their backfield should be good. Veteran quarterback there. So, we picked him 3rd. It's not like we picked him to win the division. Picked him 3rd behind Ohio State and Penn State. But to specifically answer your question, with Jim Harbaugh in charge of the program, he is one of the 3, in my opinion. Urban Meyer, Jim Harbaugh, and Nick Saban are the 3, without a doubt, slam dunk coaches. You hire them anywhere, they're going to win. Now, Dabo Swinney, you could put in that mix in a few years, but he's only done it at one program. The reason we like Jim Harbaugh and the other guys, they've done it at multiple programs, and we definitely group Harbaugh into that elite status.
You know what I'm going to be fascinated by, and we talked about this on our podcast last week, Mitch, is, it used to be when you did a college football preview, and I've just done one for fun since I was in high school every year. Nothing to the level you guys do, obviously. But whenever you want to put this together, the old formula for a lot of years, and you said you're 45, I'm 43, so we're roughly the same age. The old formula was to begin looking at returning starters, especially if one of them was a quarterback, and then look at the schedule. But because we do now have a tier of programs that are recruiting at a level higher than most of college football, they are much more in a reloading than a developmental stage. And I don't think, you look at Clemson, how many guys they've lost early to the NFL 2 years in a row. It didn't stop them from going to back-to-back national championship games. Same thing with Alabama. Every year they lose a ton of guys to the NFL. They're back in the mix the very next season regardless. And so I think now we saw it with Ohio State last year. They lost, 17 guys like Michigan did. They were right back in the playoff. And I think the question for Michigan is the last 2 years, and we looked at the roster foundation of the recruiting rankings for all the teams in college football. And what I did is I gave them, using the consensus ratings at 24/7 Sports, I gave everybody that had a 5-star 5 points, a 4-star 4 points, and a 3-star 3 points. I didn't give any points for any players lower than that because at that point they're developmental prospects. And what we found when we ranked the most talented teams in college football is Michigan had the 16th most points of any roster for a 4-year talent evaluation. But of all the teams ranked in the top 25, their roster's points had a higher percentage from the last 2 most recent classes than anybody else. 72% of Michigan's talent roster points in recruiting came from the 17 and the 16 classes, which means this is going to be one of the youngest teams in college football this year, maybe the youngest in the Power 5. And I'm going to be fascinated, Mitch, because all the other coaches we've mentioned, have had an extra year or 2 of recruiting at that level to reload with that infrastructure. And Harbaugh is going to try to do it with only 2 years of that kind of recruiting and sort of get 1 year ahead of the curve of everybody else. Do you think he can do it or not?
Yes and no. I mean, we have them 10th. Like I said, we have them 10th in the nation, 3rd in the Big Ten East. So, I do not see this as a legitimate national championship contender for all the reasons you said. But the reason that we don't predict them to fall off even further is because all those things, the way they've recruited in the last 2 or 3 years, and the Harbaugh factor. Again, keep going back to go to Wikipedia, search his page. Every year his teams are good, and not surprised it didn't take him long for Michigan to get good. I just think he has that it factor. His teams are, always, strong on both sides of the ball. I think his best work that he did, was at Stanford, obviously, what he inherited there versus what he inherited in Michigan, because he did inherit some talent. But you make a really good point, Steve, is the fact that while their roster is talented, is still very, very young. So if you're a Michigan fan, obviously you want to win the Big Ten East, but what you want to see is just that foundation continuing to grow, the young players settle the offensive line to put yourself in position to make a national championship run next year.
Finally, Mitch, let's take a quick gander around the rest of you guys' perspective on the Big Ten. Obviously, I don't think too many people are shocked. You have Alabama number 1, Ohio State number 2. That's probably going to be what most polls have, if not Florida State in that top 2 or 3, and you guys have them in there as well. But when you look at the rest of the Big Ten, some storylines that I will find fascinating, and I want to get your take on them, and we'll kind of do these rapid fire on the way out here. Sure. Let's start with number 1, Penn State. This is going to be the first time in James Franklin's coaching career he's dealt with lofty preseason expectations. When you're at Vanderbilt, this being in Nashville, even if you're winning 9 games at Vanderbilt, which is like winning 12 games anywhere else, you're not dealing with lofty preseason expectations. This is the first time Penn State as a program has really had a target on their back going back to the entire Jerry Sandusky tragedy and all the fallout there. Most of these guys were still in junior high when that was going down. They've never had to deal with that level of expectation whatsoever. And, halfway through the year last season, especially after we beat them 49-10 and the game wasn't that close, people were looking at James Franklin's replacements at Penn State. Are they ready for that bullseye on their back, Mitch?
You make great points. And, I know I'm the sideline reporter. I moonlight as a sideline reporter for Vanderbilt Radio, so I work closely with James Franklin during his time here. And that is the question. How will he handle the expectations? He's a guy that wants all the attention. He wants his program to have tons of attention. It helps them. But if things aren't going well, how will he deal with that? But I think they're poised to have a really good season. Tracy McSorley was great. He's a former 3-star recruit who was committed to Vanderbilt before James Franklin took the job, has turned out to be a perfect fit. I think Joe Moorhead last year was, probably the coordinator hire of the year. Took him a little while to get going, but that offense was so dynamic, and Saquon Barkley was great, and the offensive line finally is kind of Big Ten caliber. A lot of losses on defense, but I think Brent Pry came in, did a really good job after the surprising loss of Bob Shoop there. So I think they're going to be really good again. I understand, sometimes programs too much too soon. Can they handle the expectations there? But I think because they have a veteran team, veteran quarterback, pretty good offensive line, I do think they can handle the pressure.
Looking over quickly at the Big Ten West, where you have an interesting hodgepodge. Wisconsin brings a lot back, but what they lost were key players. Alex Hornibrook, we forget, he lost his job at the end of last year, the returning quarterback. He ended up with almost as many interceptions as touchdowns. The tailback position at Wisconsin, they tend to reload that, so I'm not necessarily concerned about it. But, everybody thinks their schedule is a lot of fluff. They have some sneaky games in there. I mean, at BYU, for example, that's not going to be an easy game. And there's some other teams in that division I'm fascinated by. PJ Fleck, obviously, the culture change. You couldn't get much more different in terms of personality between him and Tracy Claeys, but he inherits, a Minnesota program that Jerry Kill and Claeys helped to put back on solid ground. So that's a good situation there. And I think a lot of people are undervaluing Northwestern. Most of the games on their schedule this year, Mitch, they're going to have the best offensive backfield on the field in most of the games on their schedule. And when you play a lot of games that are probably going to be one-possession games, I think that's a huge advantage, Mitch.
Yeah, I like Northwestern a lot. We picked Northwestern second, picked Minnesota first. But, as the summer goes on, after our magazine comes out, we digest things more sometimes. Like we'd say, you know what, maybe we should have picked this team. Maybe we should have picked that team. Northwestern does not play Penn State, don't play Michigan, I believe. Ohio State. They don't play two of the three big teams. I don't have their schedule in front of me. And then Clayton Thorson got a lot better last year as a wide receiver, as a quarterback. Now they do lose Carr, their outstanding wide receiver, but Justin Jackson back for his fourth year. They lost some key guys on defense, but I think they're poised for a really good year. And then you mentioned PJ Fleck. I like Minnesota a lot, but they've got a major quarterback issue, and their schedule's pretty difficult. And even, I think, for the future of this division, I mean, the two of the best hires nationally were PJ Fleck at Minnesota, and I really like Jeff Brom at Purdue. Now, they've got a long way to go, but when two of your kind of off-the-radar programs have made great hires, that's really good for the Big Ten West, and it's really good for the Big Ten.
Final question for Mitch Light, editor of Athlon's College Football Preview. By the way, you guys are right on being bullish on Texas. I was telling our audience here that last week on the podcast, Tom Herman's career as an offensive coordinator and a head coach, everywhere he's gone, massive jumps in year one. And I think you'll see that at Texas. I think he's stepping into a situation with recruited, talented kids ready for a culture change, ready to work, ready to win, much like Harbaugh stepped into at Michigan a couple of years ago. But now that the magazine is done and it's out there, when the season is upon us, Mitch, what do you just know right now you guys are going to be wrong about? That if you had to go back and do it over again, there was more time, you would have been like, maybe not.
I wouldn't change anything major right now, but I can see looking back saying, why did we pick USC number 5? Did we fall? USC is a team that gets a lot of hype. A couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, consensus number 1, they had disappointed. I think it's different this year. Great quarterback. Still not sure about the head coach in that division. Their pick that high was as much of a product of not really liking anyone else in that division as being in love with USC. So we got USC number 5 overall, second in the Pac-12 behind Washington. Obviously USC winning the South. I could see us looking back in the middle of the season when USC's 5-3, saying, "What were we thinking?"
Mitch, good to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us here on the Michigan Podcast. You guys really did a fantastic job with this year's Athlon's College Football Preview. Congratulations. God bless. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on anytime. Take care, Steve.
More of the Michigan Podcast here in a moment.
Chris Hutchinson, a loss of 14 on the sack by the Wolverines. And here's Wilson dropping to throw. Safety blitz, they pick it up. Pass to the near side, intercepted by Datton. Up the sideline, 20, 15, 10, 5. It's a touchdown. Lance Datton picked it off.
This week's Twitter poll results. Do you care or pay attention to what Paul Finebaum says about Coach Harbaugh and Michigan football? 24% of you said yes. 56% of you said no. And in my favorite answer, 20% of you said, "Who's Pete Finebaum?" A reference to Coach Harbaugh snapping back at Paul by getting his first name wrong. I love it. I think that's one of my favorite trolling activities, is to act like somebody is so beneath you you don't even know their name. Well played. And now this week's viewer / question of the week. Could you see Big Ten mayhem happening this fall with Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan all ending up 11-1? The big question is, week 1, can Michigan beat Florida? However, if that occurs, I could easily see Michigan get on a roll with a favorable spread-out schedule, although at Wisconsin will be a very tough game. I can't see Penn State beating Michigan and Ohio State in back-to-back weeks. The only other game Penn State might be tested is at Northwestern, and Ohio State is one of the few teams Vegas favors in every game. That question coming from Dylan, one of our listeners/viewers. And yes, I think that could happen, Dylan. I don't think it's highly likely, however. But would that not be chaos if they all win 11-1? Penn State beats Michigan, Michigan beats Ohio State beats Penn State. Then we'd get into all kinds of tiebreakers. They'd have the same non-conference record, so because they are 11-1, so there's no extra non-conference loss there. I'm guessing the next tiebreaker would be where they'd be ranked in the college football playoff rankings. But if you're on that playoff committee, how would you differentiate with those teams at that point? That would be mass chaos for sure. Your question in terms of referring to it as mayhem, aptly worded. I just don't think, do I think it's possible? Yes. I just don't think it's very likely.
Freshman dropping back deep. 37 seconds to go in the third. There's Gillette's numbers for today. Oh, he's going to run with it. He'll get the first down and more. Maybe a score. Touchdown!
I don't think this was a freelance by Mike Gillette. This was a called play. Makes the punt. Look at it. He sees it right now. Michigan felt that Michigan State was going to come with the rush from the left side, leaving the offensive left side wide open. You'll see Mike Gillette pointing out, make a block here. I got it right there. He knows he's got the score.
And finally this week, some early Vegas point spreads are out. And here are 3, not Michigan related, that I would urge you to take a long look at. Not that I'm telling you to bet your house or anything like that, but if you were indeed inclined to wonder, what are a few games the host of the Michigan podcast thinks Vegas is wrong about? Well, I like 3 underdogs in the first couple of weeks. West Virginia +5 over Virginia Tech, Auburn +7 over Clemson, Iowa State +2 over Iowa. And the reason why I like those 3 teams, all of them have superior quarterbacks as underdogs to the teams they're favored against. And if you look annually, you see this. Well, maybe the right word's perennially. In college football, we see this every year. In the first 2 weeks, we have upsets usually for 2 reasons. The underdog either A, has a more settled and solid quarterback situation, or B, the underdog has a more settled and solid special teams situation. All 3 of those underdogs, however, are superior at quarterback. So those are 3 games I'll be looking at the opening 2 weeks of the year. Oh, and don't overreact to Vegas making Penn State a 14-point favorite over Michigan. I've seen a lot of that. Last summer, Vegas made, in their opening early lines, Vegas made Oklahoma an over touchdown favorite against Ohio State because of how much talent the Buckeyes had lost. But by the time we got to kickoff of the actual game in Norman, Oklahoma, Ohio State was a slight favorite, and then we saw them open a can. So a lot of times these early point spreads are reactions or overreactions to preseason perceptions, and then you see these lines move quite a bit when the actual game week comes along. That's why I like those 3 aforementioned underdogs, because I think those are excellent values right now. Again, I'm not urging anybody to go out and get down. I'm just saying, if you're curious, those are 3 games that I think the odds makers have wrong. Want to thank everybody for watching us again this week on the Michigan Podcast. Don't forget, you can subscribe right here. Like us on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. Follow us on Twitter @Michigan Podcast. We'll see you again next week.